Hello friends, welcome to this session. Now we are going to look at data analysis. What are the key objectives of data analysis? The objectives are to plan an analysis, program analysis, deal with chance, biases and third factors, to assess causality. That is what Dr. Sanjay Mendley talked in the first session. The essence of research is to link an exposure to an outcome, and finally to measure the impact it has in clinical or domain of science. The data analysis strategy has its sequence, and I am going to talk about these 7 steps. The first step is identifying the study type, which is essential before you venture into data analysis. The second is in terms of identifying main variables. The third, becoming familiar with the data. Fourth, characterize the study population. And fifth, examining the association between exposure and outcome based on the study type. And sixth, in terms of creating additional tables. And finally, to conduct an advanced analysis. Identifying a study type is the first and foremost step before you enter into data analysis, because it establishes the main framework. I am going to repeat again that you need to know whether you are dealing with a descriptive question or descriptive study, or you are dealing with an analytical study. If a descriptive study is involved, you need to measure a quantity and estimate appropriate indicator, which I am sure you have seen in the measurements lecture. And if it is an analytical study, you need to test a hypothesis using statistical tests. For that clarity, you need to be familiar with the study. You need to look at the protocol, especially for study objectives and study type. You need to review the entire questionnaire. You need to look at the analysis plan. You need to look at the data collection procedures. You need to obtain the electronic database, and you may have to decide on software for analysis, about which we will see at the end. This analysis depends on the statement of objectives and study type. Therefore, the nature of research question has to be very clear, whether it is descriptive, involving describing one group, measuring a quantity, or is this analytical, involving some intervention, comparing two groups and hypothesis. If it is descriptive, you need to ask this question whether it is acute or chronic outcome, and then accordingly you will zoom into a study design and then measure either incidence or prevalence. If it is analytical, and again you will ask a question, what is the study outcome? You may decide on acute or chronic outcome, and then choose an appropriate measure of indicator. It could be relative risk or risk ratio if it is cohort study, or it could be an odds ratio based on case control study, or prevalence ratio or prevalence odds ratio. So therefore, your analysis plan depends on your review of the study with reference to what is the main framework, what is the research question that they are trying to answer. The second thing, you need to identify the main variables. What are the outcomes, what are the exposures, what are the potential threat factors, and what is the variables that we need to consider for subgroup analysis. You need to be familiar, intimate with the data. How do you do that? You need to perform a frequency distribution of all the variables. Look at the frequency of all the variables in your data set. Then you look at descriptive statistics, which helps you to describe the study population. This will give you a fairly good idea of what this data set is all about. And secondly, you review the observations by its status in the database. Are there duplicates? Cross check. Look for missing observations, check the ranges and legal values against the specified that was specified in the data dictionary, check for consistency in the pattern of the data. So this is a crucial step, the third step, which you need to spend sufficient time. Fourth, you need to characterize the study population with reference to the basic characteristics of the study population. These could be in terms of socio-demographic and economic variables, by age, gender, what income groups and things like that. And then if it involves analytical study, you look at in the 2 groups or 3 groups, the comparison groups, these variables. You may want to look at frequency of clinical features as well, in characterizing the study population. Fifth is in terms of examining the outcome and exposure association. This is the most interesting part. This is based on a priori hypothesis or hypotheses, where you compare the groups for frequency of exposure using an appropriate measure of association, which we talked about earlier. This has to be based on prior knowledge, it has to be based on study design, because as you have seen earlier, each of the study design has its own measurement of association for the specific exposure and outcome. Therefore, this is a very critical step, and then you may also apply the principles that you might have learned from Dr. Tarun when he talked about the biases and confounding that can complicate this association apart from the biological and knowledge that we have about a particular exposure and outcome. The sixth step is in terms of creating additional two-way table for analyzing new variables that you may detect on the basis of findings that are already generated. The seventh step could be in terms of dose response, stratifications and multivariate modeling analysis. Therefore, these are the steps that you will conclude by analyzing the data for generating information that you think will be useful to improve the health of the study population. Some practical tips that you may want to keep in your notes is in terms of a prior plan of analysis. It is very useful. It has to be done. The data analysis has to be done, plan has to be prepared well in advance. We will recommend you to use empty tables to prepare analysis. In your reading material, you will see such empty tables. For each of the study designs, we have prepared an empty table shell. So, for your study, you can prepare a plan of action for analysis. Okay, this is how my table will look like, and then at the time of analysis, your attempt is to fill up that empty shells. The second tip is in terms of analyzing it by stage. Go by stages. You first do the recoding that is necessary. You may create new variables, you may dichotomize, you may look at the descriptive information, you may decide to change the way you cut the two groups, you may decide on 3 or 4 groups for measuring dose response based on your understanding from the data. You may do the next step of descriptive analysis and then finally analytical analysis. So, this has to be a sequential process. You should not jump. People have the tendency to jump the steps, but I think it has to be in a measured manner, one by one. And finally, please avoid any analysis that is driven by the data that you analyze without any plan. This is called post hoc analysis. You did not have a plan, you finally find something and then you try to make news out of it. Last but very important, you do not squeeze out the data because you want something. As an example, we talked about exercise and diabetics, you remember? In the initial stages of the analysis, if this question has to be answered through data analysis, we will recode the data. We will recode in terms of creating an outcome data, because we talked about blood sugar levels. So, we have to group the outcome into positive outcome, yes, reduced blood sugar level, negative outcome, no, not reduced, blood sugar is not reduced. So, that is the outcome. Then we may recode some key variables such as age groups can be cut off, income level can be used to cut off as okay income, not so okay income, or below poverty line or above poverty line and things like that. So, this recoding we may do for number of variables, including for example in terms of exercise, moderate, heavy, mild or no exercise. We can create groups during this recoding stage, and then in the descriptive stage we calculate the frequency of the outcome by each of these groups. Analytical stage, we do it in 3 steps. One is univariate analysis, where we look at one upon the other. We look at the outcome, which is in terms of reduction of blood sugar level by age, gender or income or such similar variables that are collected in the database, and then if you want to do a stratified analysis or dose response effect, you can examine outcome by categories of a particular variable. For example, if there are income categories, quartiles or levels of income, low income group, middle income group, high income group, what is the frequency of outcome you can examine, and then you may do a stratified analysis. For example, if you want to look at the exposure, that is exercise, and its relationship with reduction in blood sugar level among income groups stratified by age, gender and income. You can look at all of this in the next step. And finally, a model, logistic regression model, would tell us whether exercise can predict reduction in fasting blood sugar level in diabetics. Finally, for beginners or people who have no exposure to databases, handling databases, you may wonder what database to use. The usual trap that we get into is using spreadsheets for data management and analysis of any type and size. We think that it's a small data set, let me use it in a spreadsheet. But I think we recommend that you better avoid that temptation. Because spreadsheets are not meant to be data management or data analysis tools by per se. It's preferable to use softwares that can give you both the capabilities, data management as well as data analysis. For example, we are just suggesting that this is one of the softwares that we find very useful. It's free software called EPIInfo, which has the capability to, for example, create a data collection instrument format, enter the data, analyze using the for some of the latest visual analysis, and then it has the capability to map the information if that is part of your analysis. And finally, it can also be used for fairly good amount of statistical analysis. So, such softwares may be very helpful. We wish you good luck with your database management as well as data analysis, because that leads to report generation. Thank you very much.